Hi, welcome. It's time for some more grammar with Mr. Nance.
I love grammar and you love grammar and we love grammar, so let's have fun.
Okay, let's get into parts of speech. Parts of speech are a simple way of looking at how to classify words and how to identify what one word is and what it does. However, parts of speech is perhaps an oversimplified way of looking at language, because after all, a lot of the parts of speech do several jobs, and there's lots of gray areas and overlapping between the jobs that they do. Let me explain. Let's say you have a pretty basic noun, like the proper noun Bob. Bob is a person. Bob is definitely a noun. But is he always a noun? Well, let's say that we have the sentence, Bob eats pizza. Well, Bob is the subject of that sentence, and so Bob is definitely a noun, a proper noun. But what happens if Bob suddenly becomes descriptive? Bob's pizza is spicy. Now the noun here is pizza, and Bob is describing whose pizza. Bob is no longer doing a noun's job. Verbs can be even worse. I swim. Swim is used as a verb. I, the subject, do what? I swim. But then suddenly in the next three sentences, swimming becomes something else. Swimming is fun. Well, there, swimming is working like a noun. I love to swim. That's a completely different form, and it's also working like a noun. Swimming rapidly, I escape the shark. Well, there, swimming is working like a modifier. So, swim, the verb, can suddenly become several other things in several other forms. These other forms are called verbals, by the way. All this blending and mixing of parts of speech is really just a big mess, and it makes identifying parts of speech much more difficult than it looks like on an elementary school worksheet. Instead, I find it much more useful to think about jobs of speech, because a thing is what it does, not what it looks like. This makes categorizing words much easier, and understanding language much easier. If it's doing a noun's job, I'm going to call it a noun. If it's doing a verb's job, I'm going to call it a verb. If it's doing an adjective's job, I'm going to call it an adjective, even if it looks like a noun or a verb or whatever else. Let me give an analogy. Let's say I were to say, Mr. Nance is a runner. Well, that's true. Technically, I am a runner. I ran in high school, cross country. In fact, I was the best male runner on the cross country team. However, it's fairly irrelevant to our particular situation right now, because my ability to run has very little influence on the understanding of grammar. However, my job currently is a teacher. Mr. Nance is a teacher. That's much more relevant to what we're talking about right now. As a runner, I'm irrelevant. As a teacher, I am relevant. Back to the word swim. Swim is a verb, if it's acting like a verb, if it's doing a verb's job. Otherwise, it would be something else. Incidentally, it's worth noting that even when a part of speech does a different job than it normally would do, it still has some of the characteristics of its usual job. Verbs that are not being verbs but are being adjectives or nouns can still have objects, like the object of a participle or the object of a gerund. This is kind of like Mr. Nance at the grocery store, when technically I'm not a teacher, I'm a shopper, but I still feel it's important to point out the grammatical errors on the signs. Okay, quick review. Sentences are made up of clauses, and clauses are made up of subject and predicate pairs. Without clauses, there are no sentences, and without a subject plus a predicate, there are no clauses. The first and most important step of good grammar is identifying clauses. How many clauses are in the sentence, and what kind they are. If you can distinguish between dependent and independent clauses, and tell exactly how many are in a sentence at a glance, then you can break apart sentences, and you can figure out what they're made of. Identifying the clauses first is really important because it's pretty much impossible to identify the small parts of clauses unless you know what the big thing looks like. It's really hard to identify a piece of a creature, a bone or a muscle, if you don't know what the actual creature looks like. I like to categorize jobs of speech into two major kinds: the structural, or the skeleton, and the fluff, all the outside stuff that makes it so pretty.
I'm so beautiful.
We've said that clauses are made up of subject plus predicate, and that's where the real structure of the clause lies. The subject part is made up of the subject and all of its fluff. The predicate part is made up of the verb, its objects, and all of their fluff. Sometimes you need a conjunction to connect pieces of them, and that's also structural. But everything else just makes it pretty. A good example of this is Walt Whitman. He's famous for really long lines. One of his poems has the line, "I, chanter of pains and joys, uniter of here and hereafter, taking all hints to use them, but swiftly leaping beyond them, a reminiscent sing." Of that sentence, there's a predicate part and a subject part. The subject is I. The verb is sing. The object is reminiscence. So, if you break it down to the structure, I sing a reminiscence. Everything else is fluff. Getting rid of the fluff and finding the structure is essential to figuring out how many clauses are in a sentence and what kind of sentence you have. And it's essential to understanding the meaning of a sentence. In this particular example, there is one clause. The subject is I. The verb is heard. And the object in this particular case is step. Everything else is descriptive. It modifies and enhances and beautifies the structure. But if you're looking to understand what the basic sentence is saying, it can also distract you. I heard a step is all I really need to know that this sentence is saying. Everything else adds to and adjusts, but it doesn't help the structure of the sentence, and it doesn't help me see it as a clause. One reason to master this skill of quickly identifying clauses and their structures is to avoid those terrible run-ons and fragments. If you can see how many clauses are in a sentence and whether or not they're really clauses, it makes all the difference in the world. Look at this sentence. Beyond all of the dark and terrible forest, throughout the glittering mountains, I, the bravest of the band, turning to my companions, a sorry and bedraggled lot. This is not a sentence. Does it look like one? What is the structure of this sentence? Well, there appears to be a subject. I. There's also several other parts. Beyond all of the dark and terrible forest is a string of prepositional phrases. Of the forest, beyond. Also, throughout the glittering mountains is a prepositional phrase, throughout mountains. The bravest of the band is a description of the subject, also called in a positive. Turning to my companions is a participle phrase, turning, describing the subject, I, what he's doing. And then we have a sorry and bedraggled lot, another positive describing the companions, which are part of a prepositional phrase within the participle phrase. Where's the verb? It's not there. Turning might look a bit like the verb because it once was a verb, to turn. But in this case, turning is not working like a verb because it's not working with the subject I. I turning? No. It would be I turn. So, this is a fragment. An impressive sounding fragment, perhaps, but very much a fragment. It's the subject part of a sentence with no predicate. Just as a basketball player will continue to refine his free throw over and over and over again, practicing a very basic shot to make sure that he has it mastered, a writer will continue to refine and practice the art of breaking down a sentence, particularly the art of constructing a clause, because it's the essential, it's the basic, it's the primary part of writing and reading, understanding a clause. And in order to understand those clauses, we have to understand what job each part of the clause is doing. Just calling the part of speeches, pronouns, verbs, nouns, doesn't tell us much of anything. But understanding the job, whether it's a subject, a transitive action verb, a direct object, that helps us to understand what's going on in the sentence. Next time, we'll talk about nounish jobs. Those are jobs done by things that are acting like nouns, whether they are nouns, or are pronouns, or are gerunds. We'll look at how nouns work. So until next time, keep working on those good sentences.
Hey, baby, wanna go on a date with me?
No, you're a skeleton! Ugh!
Well, you're not so good looking yourself.